Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk about how to write learning outcomes that are measurable and specific. This is an important skill, whether you're in course design or if you're a dean or even if you're just a faculty teaching a course. Learning outcomes really shape our courses and you start with the end in mind. And so we're going to discuss a bit about the components of learning outcomes and how they can be successful, and also incorporating some new things, including digital technology and literacy, and how the 21st century is really different than the previous decade in terms of learning outcomes. So we're going to look first at basic course design, and this is the most basic that I could possibly make the course design process. The components are, we have the outcomes, we need to define what is it that the students need to do, and at the end of the course we have an assessment. How do you know that they can do what they need to do? And in between those outcomes and assessments is the course content. That would be the instruction, the assignments, assessments leading up to something that's summative, and everything in between, class activities, discussions between students. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in a course, but what shapes that would be the outcomes. The basic purpose of any assessment is really to distinguish students who have attained the learning objectives or the learning outcomes and those who have not. And if they have not, then really they shouldn't pass the course. And same goes for the program level. We have outcomes and assessments that measure program understanding. Important thing to consider though when you're looking at outcomes and assessments is that we don't want orphans. And by that, I mean, we don't want an outcome, what do students need to do, that is never assessed, that we can't determine that they can do what they're supposed to do. Likewise, we can't have an assessment that doesn't align with an outcome. You can't have an assignment saying, we're going to decompose the sub-themes from A Midsummer Night's Dream if the class is biochemistry or mechanical engineering and has nothing to do with Shakespeare or sub-themes or anything. That would be an orphan assessment because it doesn't align to an objective of the course. In reality, we're looking at outcomes as a way to really shape our teaching strategies. The assignments and assessments, they're all driven by these outcomes. And so in that way, we begin with the course development with the end in mind. And I mentioned, and jump onto the next slide, which looks very similar to this slide, basic program design is exactly the same thing. What do students need to do by the time they finish this program? And how do we know that they can do that? So it all leverages each other. Outcomes and assessments go hand in hand. So we're going to look at specific and measurable outcomes. All outcomes need to be measurable and they need to be specific. And so we don't want broad goals with no ways to measure them. I'm going to give some examples of things that I've seen as an instructional designer and throughout my career. A lot of times we'll say students will understand how an engine works, for example. Now, that's not measurable because you can't measure understanding. You can measure actions. If a student can do something, or if they can't do something, then that's something that you can assess. But you can't really assess, can they understand it or not? Are they able to formulate it into words? I mean, they can demonstrate understanding by writing an essay. In that case, the measurable action item would be they need to construct an essay and arguments or something to demonstrate how an engine works. Maybe they need to identify the key components and delineate the process of this and that. I'm one that I don't know how an engine works. I know it makes the car move, and that's how it works. If it doesn't have gas, it's not going to work. There's something called fuel injectors and pistons, and somehow that plays into it. So I'm going to scratch out that learning outcome because it's really not specific, and we can't really measure it very well. Here's another one. This is pretty common. You might see something that says students will critically reflect on the certain concepts from the reading. I'm going to say first and foremost, I'm going to scratch out the word critically because in reality, what's the difference between reflection and critical reflection? It really comes down to semantics. Unless one of the key concepts that you are teaching in the course is to distinguish between reflection and critical reflection, and you're putting meaning behind that. Otherwise, I want to get rid of the filler words. So students will reflect on the concepts of the reading. Reflection is not a very strong measurable verb. You want to have a verb that measures the ability to reflect. Have them compare and contrast, to describe, to delineate. And you want to be more specific. So reflect on concepts from the reading, reflect on managerial styles, reflect on consumer motivation. You really want to narrow that down. And so I'm going to scratch out that learning outcome as well. So here's the last one. Students will apply the concepts to a real life setting. I really like that word apply. That verb is a high level order thinking, and it's actionable, and I can see the application. I can measure the application. I can create a rubric that quantifies the extent of application to a real life setting. That's where it kind of loses me because we're not specific. What kind of real life setting were we talking about? Because watching Netflix, playing video games, going hiking or fishing, those are all real life settings, but does it really apply to whatever we're trying to learn? So I want to get a little bit more specific at the end of that. Like start out strong, applying the concepts of leadership or applying whatever concept in the class to a real life setting. Let's change that to a certain situation. So I'm going to leave you with a good outcome now. I've talked about these bad ones. Again, leveraging that word apply, I'm going to say the students will apply principles of servant leadership to a workplace setting. So we're applying something specific, principles of leadership, servant leadership, and then I'm specifying it even more to a workplace setting. And I could even specify that even more if I wanted to. I could change out workplace setting to a board meeting or to a pitch for a client or something specific where you're working with a client or a vendor. If this was a course level outcome, I think that would be fine just as it is. If it's a module or unit outcome, maybe I'll want to get a little more granular and I want to specify it. But I want to reiterate that a lot of these goals that I scratched out here are broad goals with no way to measure them. And I want to specify behaviors and degrees even, if I can. So I'm going to show an image that should be familiar to all of us, Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy originates from the 1950s. It's been altered. What we're seeing here is an alteration from the 1990s where synthesis was replaced with evaluating, they added creating, and all of these are action verbs that emphasize behaviors as opposed to application and synthesis and things like that. A lot of people distinguish this by the bottom half versus the top half. I actually like to distinguish it in triads, and so I look at and this is a very basic and kind of rudimentary way to look at this, but the basic two, remembering and understanding, are entry-level verbs that might focus more on undergraduate types of courses, since we're all in higher education here. Application, analysis, those deal with kind of master's level courses, and then evaluating and creating would be like doctoral level activities. And that's not to say that people in intro psych can't be creating and evaluating, or that PhD students have everything understood and remembered that they possibly need. There's a mix there. Some people consider the pyramid to be more like a stepping stool, or a staircase, where the foundation, remembering and understanding, once you have that basis, you can escalate up to the higher levels of thinking. And I think that's very appropriate as well, a stepping ladder where we're aspiring to those top levels, evaluating and creating. And people have used all kinds of verbs. You can go on Google and you can search for Bloom's taxonomy verbs, and you're going to have lists and lists of different verbs, such as telling and defining. I don't like this verb know, by the way, but outline, describing, I love those verbs. Organizing, illustrating, acting, investigating, critiquing is great. Compare and contrast is one I always go back to. And then producing and designing and inventing. So we're looking at Bloom's taxonomy, but I want to frame this in a different way, a very simplistic way. This is how I might explain Bloom's taxonomy to my 5th grade daughter. I'm going to look at Bloom's taxonomy when it applies to apples, and how we can progress up Bloom's taxonomy, and how our understanding, how our application of apples to our education can progress and develop, and we can nurture higher levels of thinking. So we're going to start down here at the bottom with remember. So there's certain things when we're learning about apples, like my 2-year-old daughter right now is learning about colors and shapes and foods. So she's learning about apples. What is she trying to learn about apples? That some of them are red, some are green, yellow. They're small, some are smaller than others, but they tend to be a small thing. Some of them are very sweet and some of them are sour. And so she needs to remember those things, the very basic components of the apple. As she moves up to understanding, we're looking at, okay, so we have apples. How do we know if they are ripe or not? How do we know how nutritious they are? Are apples nutritious? Are they not? Are some more nutritious than others? What climate do they grow in? Why is it that most of the apples that we have either come from Oregon or Michigan? What is it about that, that fosters good apples? I'm going to move up to applying then. So we have a basic understanding of apples and even maybe their chemistry, but let's apply it. How do you eat an apple? Do you slice it? Do you just eat it? How can you bake an apple? Are there different techniques and approaches to consuming apples? I'm going to move up to analyze. And I want to take this apple and differentiate the skin from the inside. And you even have the leaf and the peel. Do I need to wash it? What do I need to know about pesticides and washing apples? If I have an apple, what happens when I add cinnamon to the apple? How does that change? Are there other things that I can add to apples as I'm eating them or cooking with them? I'm going to move up to evaluating, and this is beyond my second grade, my 2-year-old, and moving up to my 5th grade, maybe even a junior high school student. I'm going to look at how does apple nutrition compare to other fruits or foods. I can even create a chart where I compare apples with vitamins and lemons and maybe leafy foods, and I can chart apples in terms of their vitamin nutrition content. How affordable are they? How do they taste? Do I have access to apples versus other things? And I can formulate, where do apples score compared to these other foods? And are there other foods that maybe score higher than apples in some categories or in all categories? So really using that evaluative cross-analysis process. Moving up to creating, so based on my foundational understanding all the way up to my analysis and evaluation, can I create something new with apples? Maybe do I have enough knowledge and expertise to be able to grow my own apple orchard, or can I write an apple cookbook of some sort? So you can see that progression from the early things are something that a 2-year-old would probably start to learn. Apples are red, some are green, and some are yellow, all the way up to advanced things, maybe knowing chemistry, or maybe I want to open a store that really showcases apples, an apple store, and where I sell apples and apple-related things. So I need to know an advanced level of apple knowledge. All right, so I'm going to revisit this pyramid again. This time, I'm considering this was revised in the 90s, and a lot of people are revising it for today as well. We're now in 2020, which is hard to imagine that we're 20% into the 21st century. The 22nd century is only 80% away from us if you consider that. But there are knowledge, skills, and abilities that are inherent in the workplace and in life today that weren't present even 20, 30, 40 years ago, such as the need to incorporate digital technology for learning and really for work. And so a lot of people have started producing lists of new words, new verbs to supplement Bloom's taxonomy to really supplement the digital nature of teaching and learning today. So for creating, I'm going to work from top down. In addition to creating, we might have words such as blogging, directing, producing, using technologies such as Canvas Studio or even Canvas, PowerPoint, VoiceThread, EduBlogs, using Sway, Microsoft Sway to produce things, directing, even it could be multimedia. We can look at Camtasia, or After Effects or any of the Adobe Multimedia suite. For evaluating, you might look at verbs such as posting or moderating, which I guess to post and to moderate would be the verbs, and posting would be, I don't know, adjective. I don't know, adverb. So you look at Microsoft Forms, SurveyMonkey, Poll Everywhere, a lot of technology for evaluating in a digital world. For analysis, you might look at mind mapping or curating. There are plenty of mind mapping software platforms out there, as well as things like Kahoot and quizzes could apply um, for analysis. Application, you can look at uploading, editing, platforms such as Nearpod or Powtoon for understanding. We have tweeting, hashtagging. So that could be any social media, Twitter, or you could be looking at things like Adobe Spark or Canva. And for remembering, it could be bookmarking, copying, curating. Again, there are platforms such as Wakelet, Bulb, ThingLink, Padlet. In reality, Canvas Studio, if you don't know about Canvas Studio, reach out to me or view one of our previous webinars. It's a multimedia interactive um, film creation or video creation platform within Canvas, and it spans pretty much this entire taxonomy. So the things to consider is you always want to draft out your outcomes before you choose tech. Start with the Bloom's taxonomy, and then apply some of these digital verbs. And that is going to dictate which software you would incorporate into the assignment or into the class. The technology itself, whether it's Sway or Padlet or ThingLink, the technology is not the focus. These are only vehicles for transforming student thinking at different levels, which would be the levels of the Bloom's taxonomy. And I always say in many of my presentations that EdTech is not the solution to a problem, but it can be part of the solution. So you want to ask yourself, how can EdTech support different cognitive levels, and which tools support lower level versus higher level thinking skills? And once you have those outcomes set and established, then you can look at ways to incorporate the technology to supplement that. I have a graphic. I found this on the internet, and I just couldn't find where to give attribution, but it's been floating around, and I really like this. I think it talks about 21st century skills, which, be honest, 21st century skills is kind of like what we were talking about 15 years ago, which was still half a decade into the 21st century. And there are some people who don't like that term, but in reality, I think that it's relevant in that we have certain literacy skills. If you look at this column here, information literacy, media, and technology, that are important not only for learning the subject matter within our classes and programs, but these are important life skills and especially on-the-job skills, which ultimately our institutional outcomes and goals are that our students will enter the world and be agents of change, and they'll be able to support the community, enter the workplace, and really make a difference. In order to do that, we can't neglect the technological components, the needs and expectations of the workplace and of the world, and neglect our students of that. So with that said, I think it is important to work educational technology into our learning outcomes or our prospectuses. And that could just be my bias being the director of educational technology. So, so take it or leave it. I want to present Bloom's taxonomy in a completely different spin. This is something, if you attended my seminar on at the Geo Summit last month, then you'll be able to review this. For others, this might be a new way to look at Bloom's taxonomy. Typically, we see it as a pyramid. Here we have the pyramid put on its side, and we still have the various dimensions of Bloom, the cognitive dimensions of Bloom's: remember, understand, evaluate, create, and up the scale. But in this matrix structure, we also have knowledge dimensions. We have factual, conceptual, procedural, and metacognitive dimensions. And so we're looking at factual, would correspond a lot with remember and understand, but really it could correspond with any of the cognitive dimensions as well. We're looking at knowledge, terminology, details about concepts or theories. Then we go on to conceptual, we're looking at theories or principles. Procedure would be more methodology, techniques. Is there a process that needs to be learned? Do you need to do A, B, then C, or step 1, step 2, up until you get to step 78 and 79? And then metacognitive, we're looking at strategies where context is important because it deals with conditional knowledge. When do you apply such a thing? So a lot of that would be in clinical psychology, really any kind of psychology would leverage metacognitive strategies and stuff. So now we're going to look at an example of a learning outcome. This would be an objective. And so the objective is that students will develop a new classroom behavior chart utilizing student incentive methodologies. And so we're looking at the verb and the direct object. The verb, and I have those highlighted, just so that we can have those outlined. The verb would be develop, which aligns with create, which is the cognitive process number 6, that high level of Bloom's taxonomy. And so I know that, okay, this objective aligns with cognitive dimension 6. The direct object, a new classroom behavior chart, would be something procedural. And so I'm looking at knowledge type C. So I'm going to pull up that table again, and so that we can see, put a laser here, we can see, for 1, 6, the column 6 to create, and then we can see the direct object is C, knowledge type C, procedural. And so I can go ahead and put a check in 6C. So if I were doing course development or auditing a course, then I would do this for each of the learning outcomes in the course. So let's play with this, and I'm going to put a bunch of I'm going to take all of the learning outcomes and plot them on the chart, and then look at the table and take a step back. Now this right here tells me a lot about the course, and it also potentially raises some flags. And I say potentially because not necessarily. If this is a doctorate level course, if this is towards the end of a program, and I only have one outcome that aligns with cognitive dimensions 4, 5, and 6, and only 2 that align with 3, 4, 5, and 6, then I know that for one, the students are probably going to be bored. It looks like they're doing a lot of flashcards and memorization when they're late in their class, their program, and they should be doing a lot of evaluating and creating. And so I can see this lopsided and think there are some goals. We need fewer of these outcomes and more high-level outcomes. So let's flip the scenario though. Suppose this is an intro course, a bachelor level intro to psychology or intro to biochemistry, and I see it's heavy on cognitive dimensions 1 and 2, and then it's really light higher up. That might be completely appropriate because there's a lot of foundational knowledge that they need to attain before they get up high. And perhaps I'll go ahead and look at this objective, and is this going to be something like a capstone project that they work up throughout the term and throughout the course? In that case, this could be completely appropriate. So if this is a PhD course, then perhaps not, but it depends. Is it an intro PhD course where maybe they're in the business psychology program and they're getting a fundamentals of accounting class where they have to just learn the things, as opposed to a capstone class where it should be more summative instead of formative. Another potential flag that I see that I would ask some questions about this is I don't see any outcomes that align with the metacognitive knowledge dimension. And so I have to look at really the syllabus and the program, the prospectus, and verify. I'll go ahead and verify that, is this right? Is there no metacognitive component to this course? Or is this a gap that we should really have some? And if that were the case, where should they fall along Bloom's taxonomy? Should they be high level? Should they be spread out? Should they be low level? And then I would want to either revise or create new learning outcomes to make sure that we have that. And so I can't really think, I don't know, Thad, you can hop on if you have any ideas. I can't really think of a course that would be very evenly spread out among this entire, so for example, one learning outcome for every single cell. I think that would be I think it would be overwhelming for students who are intro students, and I think it would be underwhelming for students who are advanced. And perhaps there's a MOOC somewhere where the class spans from beginner to intermediate to advanced, but in reality, those should probably be 2 or 3 different classes. Once you have your learning objective, then you'll identify the verb. You can circle which which knowledge dimension or which cognitive dimension it falls on, outline the direct object, circle that, and then you can plot out the course. And on the second page here, it has the same table, but it's a bit more worked out. And this is on legal. If you print it out, it would be a page of letter and a page of legal, where it has a bit more information to guide you through charting your learning outcomes. I want to thank everybody for joining me for this webinar on how to create measurable learning outcomes that are also specific. And I hope that these resources will help you and guide you as you think of assessments and activities and engage in your course development processes. So thank you, and we'll see you all next time.